Racist cop accuses black woman of theft, but her evidence turns the tide. In this gripping video, we delve into an intense confrontation between a police officer and a black woman falsely accused of theft. The encounter unfolds in a public setting, drawing attention from onlookers who witness the unfolding drama. If you are enthusiastic about this narrative, please inform us. If you appreciated the video, press 1. If not, select 0. Your feedback genuinely motivates me to collect additional uplifting and significant narratives.
Maria Silva parks her car on a busy street, unaware that this would mark the beginning of an event that would change both her life and that of one of her subordinates. As she heads to a personal appointment, a young police officer, James Johnson, watches her from a distance. With eyes full of suspicion, he judges her at first glance, failing to recognize who she is. He sees a black woman stepping out of a luxury car and immediately believes something is wrong. Tension begins to rise as Johnson decides to approach her, already convinced that she must be there for illicit reasons. Maria notices the officer's watchful eyes, but keeps walking as if nothing had happened. However, the confrontation is inevitable. Maria carefully parked her car on Main Street. It was a busy late afternoon in downtown. She glanced in the rearview mirror, adjusting her short, sleek hair, and took a deep breath. It was rare for her to have time for personal errands, and this moment was important. Dressed simply, in dark jeans and a white shirt, she looked like just another ordinary citizen. A black woman walking down the street, carrying a brown leather purse over her shoulder. As she got out of the car, she didn't immediately notice the fixed gaze that was following her from a distance. Officer James Johnson, leaning against his patrol car just a few meters away, watched her with growing intensity. His eyes scanned the luxury vehicle Maria had just locked up, a silver Lexus. Johnson's thoughts started to race, constructing stories in his mind. A woman like that? Driving a car like this? He muttered to himself, adjusting his sunglasses. Hey! His voice cut through the air as he approached Maria. Is that your car? Maria paused for a second, surprised by the abrupt interruption. She turned slowly and faced him, maintaining the calm demeanor she had learned over the years. She recognized the tone. She'd heard it many times before, but something in his eyes told her this encounter would be different. Yes, it's mine, officer, she replied without changing her tone, as if this were an ordinary conversation. Is there a problem? Johnson let out a short, disdainful laugh. He shook his head, visibly incredulous. Yours? He looked her up and down with a gaze full of contempt and arrogance. Do you think I'm stupid or something? Maria remained calm, but her patience was starting to wear thin. She knew where this was heading, but didn't want to believe that in the 21st century, a man could still judge someone so blatantly by their appearance. I'm not questioning your intelligence, officer, she said in a firm tone. I'm just telling the truth. The car is mine. Johnson scoffed, taking a step forward, invading Maria's personal space. Some pedestrians began to slow down, curious about the scene that was unfolding. He placed his hand on the holster of his gun, an automatic, intimidating gesture. Papers. Now, he said through clenched teeth. Maria raised an eyebrow. Inside, she felt a wave of indignation rising. She knew she could settle this in seconds. All she had to do was show her badge as the police chief, and the young officer would immediately regret his actions. But something held her back, a desire to let him dig deeper into his own prejudice. Maybe, in the end, he could learn something. I don't have to show you my papers on the street without any apparent reason, officer, she said, her serenity only adding to Johnson's growing frustration. He clenched his fists, visibly angered by her refusal. In his mind, she was defying his authority. A black woman daring not to comply with a simple command. How dare she? Are you refusing to cooperate? He asked, his voice rising. I can take you to the station for obstructing justice. You know that? Maria met his gaze, showing no fear. I suggest we do that, then. You can take me to the station, she said with a slight tilt of her head, making it clear that she wasn't intimidated by his threats. Oh, really? You think you're smart, don't you? Johnson said with a sarcastic smile. We'll see how smart you feel when you're in a cell tonight. He turned, trying to hide his own hesitation. There was something about the way she looked at him that made him uneasy, but his pride and anger wouldn't allow him to back down. Instead, he decided to humiliate her in an even more degrading way. "Hands on your head," he ordered, pulling out his handcuffs from his belt. "Are you serious?" Maria asked, keeping her voice steady, though she could feel the humiliation beginning to wash over her. "Hands on your head now," Johnson shouted. The pedestrians nearby started to stop and watch, murmuring amongst themselves. Some pulled out their phones, recording the scene. Reluctantly, Maria raised her hands above her head. Johnson approached her without ceremony, frisking her clumsily and invasively, patting her pockets and checking her bag. With every touch, the humiliation grew, but Maria remained still, determined to keep her dignity. "Nothing," he muttered, frustrated when he found nothing to support his suspicions. Still, he thought she had to be hiding something. It couldn't be possible that he was wrong about this. He decided that the best way to end this would be to take her to the station. At least there, he could get her to talk. Johnson cuffed her with a rough gesture and gave her a slight push towards the patrol car. "We'll see who you really are. At the station, you'll learn to respect the law," he said, shoving her into the back of the car. Maria didn't say a word. The sound of the cuffs echoed in her ears, along with the murmurs of the crowd watching without intervening. The public humiliation was clear, and the anger swelled in her chest. But still, she remained silent, knowing that the end of this story would be much more revealing than he could ever imagine. The patrol car started moving through the city streets, with Johnson keeping his eyes on the road, unaware that with every second, he was sinking deeper into the consequences of his own actions. Inside the car, Maria closed her eyes for a moment. She thought about how, even after so many years of hard work and earned respect, the weight of prejudice could still be imposed on her in such a degrading way. And yet, that young officer was about to learn a lesson he would never forget. The sound of the sirens drowned out the murmurs of the street as the patrol car sped through the city center. Maria sat in the back seat, her wrists tightly bound by the handcuffs. Her hands tingled from the pressure of the metal, but she refused to show any sign of distress. Her eyes were fixed on the scenery rushing past the window, her mind focused on one single thought: the moment when this absurd situation would finally come to an end. Johnson, at the wheel, kept his lips pressed together, trying to contain the anger swelling inside him. He still couldn't believe the audacity of this woman. "Who does she think she is?" he repeated in his mind. Her calm demeanor only made him more irritated. Something wasn't right, something he couldn't put his finger on, but it filled him with a silent rage. For a moment, he thought about striking up a conversation, trying to intimidate her one more time, but decided against it. In his mind, she was already guilty. As soon as they reached the station, he'd check the records and prove he was right. The station was only a few minutes away, but every second dragged on, weighed down by the tense silence inside the car. Maria remained completely quiet, while Johnson's gaze alternated between the road and the rearview mirror, as if he was waiting for some sign of regret or fear on her face. "You can still talk, you know?" Johnson finally broke the silence, looking at her through the rearview mirror. "Confessing now could make things easier for you. I might go easy on you. Maybe let this slide. If I were you, I wouldn't risk it." Maria met his gaze in the mirror, her eyes calm, but loaded with a seriousness that made him look away. "You still don't understand, do you?" She spoke for the first time since they got in the car. Her voice was quiet, almost a whisper, but it carried a weight that Johnson felt in his gut. "Understand what?" he replied with a forced laugh. "You're the one who doesn't understand the seriousness of this situation. That car is stolen, and you're going to jail." Maria smiled slightly, but it wasn't a mocking smile. It was the smile of someone who knew an inconvenient truth was about to surface. She looked out the window, ignoring his persistence. Johnson gripped the steering wheel tightly. Something was out of his control. He could feel it, but he couldn't pinpoint what. The tension in the car was growing heavier by the second, making him uncomfortable. He needed to restore his sense of authority, needed to prove he was in charge. When they arrived at the station, Johnson quickly got out of the car and yanked the back door open. He pulled Maria by the arm, leading her inside the building. Several officers nearby turned their heads to watch the scene, some whispering to each other when they noticed Johnson bringing in a handcuffed woman without a uniform or any other identification. A light murmur spread through the station, but Johnson ignored it, convinced he was doing the right thing. "Need any help, boss?" asked one of the officers at the entrance, noticing Johnson's tense demeanor. "No, I've got this under control," he responded curtly. "I'll deal with this now." "This one." He hesitated for a second, realizing he didn't even know the woman's name. "She was caught with a stolen car. She's going straight to the interrogation room." Maria still said nothing, only observing her surroundings as Johnson escorted her. He led her to a small room in the back of the station. It was cold and sterile, with a metal table and 2 chairs, just like the one she had used countless times in her own career while interrogating suspects. But this time, ironically, it was her sitting on the other side. Johnson shoved her into the chair, roughly, as if trying to remind himself who was in charge here. He slammed the door shut and stood there for a moment, breathing heavily. "Now you're going to talk. And you're going to talk fast," he said, walking around the table and sitting across from Maria. "Who are you? Whose car is that? Where did you get it?" Maria crossed her arms, the handcuffs still locked around her wrists. She watched him in silence, analyzing every word and movement. There was a weariness in Johnson's eyes, something deeper than anger. He seemed to be carrying a burden much heavier than this incident. She could see it, but even so, he remained blind in his fury. "I've already told you. The car is mine," Maria said calmly. "And my name is Maria Silva. You should check the police records before making any more mistakes." Johnson laughed, leaning forward, crossing his arms on the table. "Oh, really? You think you can fool me that easily? We'll see what the records say. But let me tell you something. When I find out you're lying, things are going to get ugly for you." He stood up, heading toward the door. Before he left, he paused, glancing over his shoulder one last time. "Wait here. Don't go anywhere, of course," he said with irony, shaking the handcuffs in the air. As soon as the door closed, Maria took a deep breath. That brief moment of solitude gave her time to process the humiliation she was going through. The silence in the room was oppressive, and the echo of her breaths seemed to amplify the absurdity of the situation. She, the police chief, was sitting in handcuffs, being interrogated by one of her own subordinates. But the worst part wasn't the humiliation itself. What bothered her most was knowing that this was just a reflection of something much larger, a system that still viewed people like her with suspicion, with contempt, with prejudice. Outside, Johnson walked quickly down the hallway, muttering to himself as he neared the records room. He was determined to prove he was right. He needed this, not just to reaffirm his authority over this woman, but because at that moment he needed to feel in control of something. His marriage was falling apart, his finances were a mess, and now this situation was slipping through his fingers. He needed a win, no matter how small. When he reached the records room, Johnson approached the desk with firm steps. The clerk, an older officer, lazily looked up and asked, "Need something, Johnson?" "Yeah, I need you to check the name Maria Silva for me. I want all the records you've got on her. She's involved in a car theft case." The clerk sighed, typing the name into the computer with the slow pace typical of someone who's been on the job too long. Johnson tapped his foot impatiently, and then the sound of the keyboard stopped. The clerk stared at the screen with a look of surprise. He blinked a few times, as if trying to process the information in front of him. "Are you sure that's the name?" the clerk asked, glancing up at Johnson. "Yes. What's the problem?" The clerk swallowed hard and looked back at the screen. "Johnson, Maria Silva is the police chief." The sentence came out slowly, laced with disbelief. Johnson's face went pale immediately. He froze, feeling the weight of his actions crash down on him like an avalanche. For a moment, he didn't know how to react. The silence around him became deafening. What had he done? Johnson stood frozen, unable to react. Heat rushed to his face, his blood pounding in his temples. He blinked repeatedly, hoping he had heard wrong. "What did you say?" His voice was low, almost a whisper. The records clerk stared at him with wide eyes, as if waiting for an answer that might ease the imminent embarrassment. "Maria Silva is the police chief Johnson, he repeated slowly, as though the words hadn't fully sunken yet. Johnson's mind was spinning. Chief of police? That woman. The woman he had handcuffed in front of everyone, frisked on the street, humiliated without giving her a chance to explain. She was the commander. No. He shook his head, trying to reverse the course of the situation. That can't be right. She said she owned the car. This doesn't. The clerk wasn't listening anymore. The information he had just shared was already causing a stir throughout the station. Some of the older officers began to look at Johnson oddly. He could feel the weight of their gazes on his back. Without saying another word, Johnson turned and hurried back down the hallway. His footsteps echoed off the station's walls, and with every step, the panic inside him grew. What have I done? He needed to think fast, needed to fix this before the situation spiraled further out of control. But it was already out of control. He knew that. The damage was done. When he reached the interrogation room again, his hand trembled as he opened the door. Maria was still sitting there, calmly, with the handcuffs on her wrists, waiting. Her eyes lifted as Johnson entered, and she could see in his face that he had finally learned the truth. Johnson closed the door behind him, leaning against it for a moment. He took a deep breath, searching for the right words. But Maria's silence, her calm and steady posture, disarmed him completely. Johnson began, but his voice failed. He wiped his sweaty forehead and approached the table. I didn't know. I made a mistake. Maria watched him in silence, not saying a word. The room seemed to shrink around Johnson, as if the air was growing denser. The weight of what he had done was crushing him. But Maria's composure made it all the more unbearable. Chief Silva, he said, trying to reclaim some authority in his voice, though it was clear that it had already been completely lost. I made a grave mistake. I know it was you. You acted how you act every day. Maria finally responded, her voice calm but full of conviction. The mistake you made wasn't because you didn't know who I was. It's because you saw a black woman and made your own assumptions. That's the problem here, Johnson. You shouldn't have to know who I am to treat me with respect. The silence that followed Maria's words felt heavier than the steel of the handcuffs on her wrists. Johnson opened his mouth to respond, but there were no words that could justify what he had done. He slumped into the chair across from her, defeated. He started again, but Maria leaned forward slightly, cutting him off. You thought I was stealing the car. Because of what? Because I'm black and driving a luxury car? Her voice wasn't loud, but each word hit Johnson like a punch. How many times have you done this to others? How many people like me have you humiliated just for existing? Johnson looked down, unable to hold her gaze. The truth was brutal, but he couldn't escape it. I was wrong, he finally said, his voice low, almost inaudible. I made a terrible mistake, Chief. I don't know what came over me. You were what? Maria interrupted again, her tone sharper. Frustrated? Angry? And decided to take it out on me? Johnson felt the weight of each word. He knew there was more to what was happening with him. His personal problems, his crumbling marriage, the debt piling up, the frustration of never feeling in control of his own life. And now, all of it had bled into the biggest mistake of his career. I'm going through a hard time, he admitted, feeling the pressure in his chest tighten. My marriage is falling apart. I'm drowning in debt. And I lost control. I know it doesn't excuse what I did, but Maria watched him as he spoke. She saw the regret, but she also knew that the issue was much bigger than Johnson's personal struggles. She had seen this behavior repeated by so many others within the force. He wasn't the first to use his frustrations to justify racism. And unfortunately, he likely wouldn't be the last. That's part of the problem, Johnson, she said. You and many others use your badge as an excuse to take out your frustrations on the vulnerable. Racism isn't just about what you think of me. It's about what you do with the power you have. And you use that power to humiliate me, without even questioning your actions. Johnson ran his hands over his face, frustrated with himself. He had never seen himself that way, but now, everything seemed exposed. All his arrogance, all the prejudice he had never admitted to having, was laid bare in front of him, impossible to deny. What's going to happen to me now? he asked, his voice barely a whisper. He knew he was finished, but there was something desperate in the question. Maria uncrossed her arms and looked at him for a moment before responding. You'll be held accountable for your actions, just like anyone else. I'm not going to let this slide, Johnson, she said clearly. But this isn't just about punishment. You're going to have to learn. You'll have to reflect on what you did and how you act. And I'm not just talking about what happened today. If you want to continue being a police officer, you're going to need to understand that the uniform you wear demands much more than just following orders. Johnson felt Maria's words like a verdict, but also like an opportunity. He knew that from this moment on, his life would change completely. Not only was his career at risk, but his very identity as a police officer. He would have to face the consequences and, above all, confront himself. I understand, and I'll accept the consequences, he said, his voice firm. But I want to change. I'm not that person. I don't want to be. Maria studied him for a few more seconds, evaluating the sincerity in his words. We'll see, Johnson. We'll see. Johnson walked out of the interrogation room, his legs trembling. It felt like he had just left a losing battle, and the weight of defeat still hung heavily on his shoulders. The hallway seemed longer than usual, and the walk to his superior's office felt endless. The news had already spread through the station. Everyone knew what had happened, and the whispers were inevitable. He could feel the stares of his colleagues, some discreet, others direct, as if he were a ghost haunting the place. When he finally reached the captain's office, he took a deep breath and knocked on the door. Come in. The captain's voice was firm from the other side, and Johnson obeyed, opening the door slowly. The captain, a middle-aged man with a face marked by years of experience, watched him in silence for a moment. His expression made it clear that he already knew everything. Sit down, Johnson. The captain's voice was controlled, but there was a tone of disappointment in it. We need to talk. Johnson sat, tension tightening every muscle in his body. He knew there was no escape from what was coming. You know what this is about, right? The captain said, resting his elbows on the desk. I got a call, directly from Chief Maria Silva. You handcuffed your own boss on the street today, treated her like a criminal, and humiliated her in front of everyone. Johnson lowered his head. He already knew the worst was coming, but hearing the words from the captain made the weight of the situation feel even more unbearable. Captain, he began, but the captain cut him off with a wave of his hand. There's no excuse, Johnson. He stared directly into Johnson's eyes. You made a colossal mistake. One that could not only end your career, but also damage the public's trust in our department even further. You know how hard we fight to maintain credibility with the community. And then you go and do this. Johnson shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He felt the guilt, but also the shame of being in this position. How had it come to this? Everything was a blur now. His hands were sweating, and the feeling of helplessness grew with each passing second. Captain, I know I made a grave mistake. I was frustrated, I lost my temper, but I want to fix this. I'm not that person. I can do better. Johnson tried to keep his voice steady, but there was a clear tremor in his words. The captain looked at him skeptically, though there was something in his eyes that hinted at a small opening. This isn't just about fixing things, Johnson. What you did is symptomatic of a much bigger problem within our institution. You acted with prejudice, arrogance, and abuse of power. This wasn't a moment of weakness. It was a failure of character. He paused, crossing his arms. Maria Silva is level-headed, but she's going to want you to pay for this. And honestly, I don't know if I can protect you this time. Johnson felt a tightening in his chest. The career he had built, despite all his flaws, was about to collapse. So what do I do? Johnson asked, his voice laced with desperation. Tell me what to do. I need a chance to prove I can change. The captain sighed, shaking his head slowly. First, you're going to be suspended. Without pay. That's the least we can do given the situation. In the meantime, you're going to undergo intensive retraining in ethics and re-education. You'll be closely monitored by everyone here. A formal recommendation for behavioral reevaluation has been made for you. And believe me, you're going to feel the weight of that. Johnson took a deep breath, trying to absorb the captain's words. Suspended. He knew it was only the beginning. But he also knew he was about to face an uphill battle to regain the respect of his colleagues, if that was even possible. "And what about Chief Maria?" he asked, almost afraid of the answer. The captain remained silent for a moment, carefully considering his response. "Maria Silva doesn't want your head. At least, not yet. She's a fair leader, but firm. And she wants you to deeply understand what you did. It's going to be a long road to redemption, if you even manage to get there. She told me she wants to see you truly take responsibility for your actions. And that goes beyond just punishment." Johnson nodded, accepting what he already knew was the inevitable path ahead. "I understand, Captain. I accept the consequences. I want to learn from this. I don't want to be known for this mistake. I want to be a better cop." The captain studied him for a few seconds, as if trying to gauge how sincere his words were. "We'll see, Johnson," he said, repeating Maria's words. "We'll see." Across the city, Maria had finally arrived home. The day had been long and exhausting, and she couldn't help but feel emotionally drained. But there was a quiet sense of calm that came from knowing she had handled the situation in the best way possible. She set her bag down on the couch, removed her badges, and allowed herself a moment to relax. Sitting in her armchair, Maria reflected on the incident. The humiliation she had suffered on the street still echoed in her mind. It wasn't just Johnson's actions, but everything that those actions symbolized. She knew that racism within the police force was still a harsh reality, even as chief. She picked up the phone and dialed the commissioner's number. They needed to discuss more than just Johnson's punishment. They needed to talk about the structural changes that were still necessary. "Commissioner Andrews?" Her voice was tired but firm. "We need to talk. There's something bigger here than just one officer doing wrong." Andrews, on the other end of the line, readily agreed. He knew Maria had a clear vision of what was at stake. "I'm listening, Maria. What do you have in mind?" "I want the re-education and retraining program to be mandatory for all officers, not just Johnson. This needs to be a priority if we're going to rebuild the public's trust in this institution. What happened today wasn't an isolated mistake. It's part of a much larger problem that needs to be addressed at its root." Andrews was silent for a moment, absorbing Maria's words. He knew she was right. The incident with Johnson was a reflection of an issue that had been ignored for too long. "I'm with you. We'll take action, Maria. You'll have all the support you need to implement these changes." Maria hung up the phone, feeling a slight sense of relief. The fight was far from over, but at least she knew she was heading in the right direction. The next morning, Johnson woke up early. His suspension had begun, and with it, the first day of his re-education training. He dressed slowly, his mind still heavy with everything that had happened. The walk to the training center was quiet, and for the first time, he felt the real weight of his position. Every step he took now was a step toward facing his flaws, his beliefs, and his actions. He knew it would be a long journey, and he wasn't sure if he'd ever regain the respect of his colleagues or of himself. When he reached the training center, Johnson paused for a moment, took a deep breath, and walked in. It was the beginning of his re-education, but he knew the road ahead would be difficult. The months following the incident were transformative for James Johnson. The re-education program was not what he had expected. It wasn't just about sitting and listening to lectures on racism and ethics. It was a deep process that forced him to confront parts of himself he had avoided for years. Sitting in a room with other suspended officers, Johnson heard stories of prejudice, injustice, and pain. Stories told by people of color, women, and minorities who had been targeted by the very system he represented. For the first time, he began to understand the real impact of his actions. With each session, he realized that his behavior wasn't an isolated case, but part of a much larger problem. The training gave him a new awareness. The discomfort he initially felt was replaced by deep shame, but also a desire to do better. One day, at the end of a session, Johnson stayed late, reflecting on the stories he had heard. The instructor, a former officer who now worked as an educator, approached him. "Tough, isn't it?" the man asked, sitting down next to Johnson. Johnson nodded, still processing everything. "Yeah, I never thought of any of this like this. I never saw racism as something so present in my own life. I thought it was something distant, something I wasn't a part of," he said, his voice full of regret. The instructor looked at him, understanding. "Most people don't see it, until they're forced to. But recognizing it is the first step. The question now is, what are you going to do about it? That question echoed in Johnson's mind for days afterward. He knew that just attending the classes wasn't enough. He needed to change his attitude, his actions. He had to earn back the trust not only of his colleagues, but of the community he had sworn to protect. Meanwhile, Maria Silva continued her journey as the leader of the police force. The incident with Johnson had been a turning point, not just for him, but for her as well. The episode had made it clear that, despite being at the top of the hierarchy, the changes needed in the police force ran much deeper. She knew she couldn't fight the system alone. In the months that followed, Maria successfully implemented the re-education program across the entire police force, with the support of Commissioner Andrews. There was resistance, of course, but Maria didn't back down. She knew that in order to restore respect and trust within the community, they needed to act with firmness and persistence. One day, while reviewing reports in her office, a light knock on the door interrupted her concentration. "Come in." When the door opened, there stood Johnson, in his immaculate uniform, but with a different posture. He seemed more humble, more introspective. It was clear that something had changed in him. "Chief Silva, may I speak with you?" he asked, his voice low, almost hesitant. Maria observed him for a moment before nodding. "Come in, Johnson." He entered the room and stood before her desk, his hands clasped in front of him. Maria watched him closely, trying to determine if the change she saw in his demeanor was genuine. "I wanted to thank you," Johnson began, his voice serious. "I wanted to thank you for not giving up on me, even when you had every right to. The training was tough, but it opened my eyes to things I had never seen before. I was blinded by my own pride, my frustration, and by the racism I never wanted to admit existed in me." Maria remained silent, allowing him to speak. It was important to hear what he had to say. "What I did to you was unacceptable. There are no excuses. I know the consequences of what I did will follow me for the rest of my life. But I also know I can be better. I want to be better, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to prove that I can change." He paused, looking directly at Maria. There was a sincerity in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he continued, "but I want you to know that I'm truly sorry. What happened that day, it was the worst mistake of my life, and I'm here to take full responsibility for it." Maria watched him in silence for a few moments, weighing his words. She knew that changes like this didn't happen overnight. Johnson had a long road ahead of him, but the fact that he was standing there acknowledging his mistakes was an important step. "Johnson," Maria began, her voice firm but without hostility, "recognizing your mistakes is the first step. But the hardest part is continuing to change. You'll have to prove, day after day, that you've truly learned something from this experience. And it won't be easy. People will doubt you. Your colleagues will look at you differently. But if you really want to be a better officer, you'll have to accept that and keep moving forward." Johnson nodded, visibly relieved to hear those words, even though they were tough. "I understand, Chief, and I'm ready for that." Maria stood up, crossing her arms as she looked at him. She knew this moment was important, both for him and for her. It wasn't just about forgiveness, but about responsibility, learning, and above all, real change. "Then let's see, Johnson. Let's see if you can truly honor the badge." Johnson nodded once more, acknowledging the challenge ahead. He turned to leave, but before he did, he looked back at Maria. "Thank you, Chief. Really." Maria simply nodded, and he left the room, closing the door behind him. After he was gone, she allowed herself to take a deep breath. The fight for justice and equality within the police force was a long one, but moments like that gave her hope that, little by little, things could change. Months later, the precinct had become more adjusted to the new guidelines. The re-education program had been expanded to all divisions of the police force, and Maria knew that the full impact would take time to see. But she believed they were on the right path. The small signs of change were noticeable in the attitudes of the younger officers and in the way cases of abuse were taken more seriously. As for Johnson, he continued his journey of rebuilding. He still carried the